history of compulsory education, which began to arise in 1865 through the 1920s, is extremely important to education as a whole in the United States. Compulsory education during this time period began to pave the road towards the education system we have as a nation today. The first state to actually pass compulsory education laws was Massachusetts, and this occurred in 1952. Though this was before our designated time period, it is important to understand that this led the movement towards compulsory education in the U.S. In fact, every state in America had compulsory education laws by the 1930s. This means that there was some pretty important progresses going on during our time period of 1865 to 1920. Before we get too deep, we must understand what compulsory education means. Compulsory education actually means that all students are required to attend school. Though this did not happen right away during this time period, it eventually became the foreground of American education. These laws led to more children than ever attending schools. In 1869, roughly 65% of children between the ages of 5 and 17 regularly attended a school. We see the effect of compulsory education laws grow even more towards the end of this time period. By 1919, 78% of the same age group was regularly attending a school. This trend has continued, and school attendance rates are actually still rising today. What is even more impressive is the rate of population increase in the United States. Between 1880 and 1920, the population of the U.S. grew by 108%. This number sounds pretty high, but is nothing compared to the whopping 1,900% increase of students enrolling in schools. Though it was a long time ago, this was the beginning of education in the United States as we know it today. During this time, like we often see today, schools were run by individual states, cities, and superintendents. Though this was the case at the beginning of this time period, students were not taught in the same ways that they are taught today. Students were actually initially taught how to work and be most productive in assembly lines and factories so that they would be more productive and useful in society after school. This rapidly began to change after the Civil War when the idea of kindergarten was implemented. The entire idea of kindergarten was extremely progressive and focused on humanistic theories that had never been introduced in the United States before. Kindergarten began to completely redefine what the focus of schools were. Instead of preparing students for industrial and assembly line work, schools began to focus on some of the educational subjects that we learn about today. Initially, music, games, stories, and language education were the core of kindergarten. These prepared the young students to eventually learn even more. The movement for better education for the youth did not stop after kindergarten was implemented. By 1893, the NEA appointed a committee to examine and implement a curriculum for elementary schools. This again was extremely progressive for the time. Schools were finally coming together and giving students across the country similar educational standards. This new curriculum called for the implementation of Latin, modern language, and algebra in schools. Soon after, the 5 basic subjects of schools as we know them today were introduced. Grammar, language, arithmetic, geography, and history became the core of elementary schools. No longer was school completely focused on the creation of better labor. Schools were now attempting to create a more open-minded and well-rounded learners. Around the same time the elementary curriculum was being remolded, the NEA began working on a high school curriculum. The new high school curriculum included Latin, Greek, English, mathematics, physics, astronomy, natural sciences, history, government, and geography. As you can tell, schools were rapidly changing. The curriculums during this time period were nothing like school agendas of the past. The new goal for schools was to prepare students for life. Schools were now stressing the importance of the humanities, languages, and sciences. Between 1913 and 1918, schools seemed to be even more progressive. The NEA set up a committee to help students be even more successful. This committee had a single goal of accommodating for differences in scholarly abilities in students. Because they knew that this would not be easy to do, the committee came up with 7 basic goals to help aid the process. These 7 goals were focused on health, command, fundamental process, home life, vocation, citizenship, worthy use of leisure time, and ethical character. Though students were learning more than ever, schools were still not able to stand on their own. They needed and received help from many other groups. Professional organizations began to play an extremely vital role. They began to influence and develop schools even more. An example of one of these organizations was the National Foundation of Teachers, which was founded in 1916. Being in the 20th century and during the women's suffrage movement, women were now becoming more involved in schools as well. More women were able to become teachers and join such organizations, and women were finally starting to play a large role in the development of school policies. Opportunities for education for African Americans were also beginning to emerge around this time. The Freedom Bureau, a government-funded organization, had the sole job of helping former slaves get an education. Though still segregated and mostly focused on just reading, writing, and industrial skills, over 500 schools for previous slaves opened in the South. Education was no longer limited by race or gender, but the qualities and funding of education were not yet equal. Overall, the beginning era of compulsory education between the years of 1865 and 1920 was an extremely progressive time period. Schools were becoming more organized and more accepting. Minorities and women were now able to get some kind of education, which was a huge step. Students and teachers came to have new roles that were never seen before. Students now had the role of learning about and understanding the foundations of a ton of subjects, and teachers were expected to fulfill their need for more and more information. This time period in educational history was one of the most vital pieces in transforming education in the United States into the system that it is today.